To order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time, and all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. This hearing is entitled Evaluating CFIUS, Challenges Posed by a Changing Global Economy. Without objection, the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Posey, is permitted to participate in today's subcommittee hearing. Mr. Posey is a member of the Financial Services Committee, and we appreciate his interest in this important topic. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes to give an opening statement. Napoleon famously said that an army marches on its stomach, meaning if it ran out of provisions, an army would quickly cease to be useful. To paraphrase that line, an economy marches on investment. And for that reason, the American economy always has welcomed foreign as well as domestic investment. But with increasing globalization has come an increased velocity of international investment and developing economies with geysers of money to invest. And in turn, that has brought some caution to our welcoming posture. In 1975, concerned that barrels of petrodollars would distort the economy, President Ford created a multi-agency panel to monitor foreign investment. In 1988, concerned that Japanese yen were flooding the United States, President Reagan signed legislation that gave him the authority, working through that panel, to actually block a foreign investment that threatened national security. 10 years ago, in the aftermath of the first big wave of terrorism, Congress upgraded the panel's enabling legislation again. Now, a new tide of money has hit the U.S. shores, but it comes from China, which many fear is not merely a business competitor that plays hardball harder than most, but actually a threat to national security. To that end, our colleague Robert Pittenger and Senator John Cornyn have undertaken a year-long study of that multi-agency panel, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, known by its acronym as CFIUS, and proposed some changes. To evaluate the challenges posed by this new global economic environment, the committee today is holding its second hearing on CFIUS in less than a month, part of an effort that I believe will consume much of the committee's energy in the first half of this year. We are fortunate to have, as we did in our first hearing, top-flight witnesses to discuss CFIUS operations and the challenges it faces. We have a former Deputy Secretary of Commerce, the former Director of National Intelligence, a former senior staffer from the National Security Committee, and 2 top economists from a pair of the elite think tanks in this country. One theme we will discuss today is perhaps at the center of how we should consider any changes. Can we precisely define the technologies or ideas or techniques we need to protect, and can we find ways to protect them without unnecessarily affecting other flows of capital or creating an investment scrutiny regime so onerous that good money just decides to go somewhere else? Could we inadvertently make the U.S. investment climate so difficult that even U.S. companies move their research and development efforts, the labs that create the innovations that have kept our economy strong and vital for so many decades, to other countries, even to China? With the best intentions, could we do CFIUS reform that fails to improve U.S. national security, or worse, enacts reforms that will make the American people less safe than we started? I believe Congress can achieve the opposite. I believe we can modernize the CFIUS review process so that it better addresses security threats while avoiding undue harm to U.S. business at home or to its efforts to compete abroad. And I believe that with enough effort, we can do that relatively quickly, even in what is likely to be a hard-fought election year, because protecting national security and protecting U.S. economic interests are bipartisan goals we always have been able to work together on productively. As evidenced by the first CFIUS hearing this committee held less than a month ago, members are engaged on the issue, educated about the process, and already working on solutions. And I'm hopeful, confident even, that we will be successful in crafting an approach that will get to the President's desk before the August work period. That's going to take a lot of work here and in the U.S. Senate, and it's going to require a lot of input from outside voices interested in a successful outcome. But I believe it is achievable and that it must be achieved, and I'm anxious to get to work. Again, I'd like to recognize the work of our colleague, Mr. Pittenger, and for his leadership on this issue. And with that, I yield back the remainder of my time and would yield to the ranking member for an opening statement.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thank our distinguished panel for appearing here today. Wish everyone a happy new year. And I just want to start out by agreeing with the chairman that this is definitely a bipartisan issue. While on one hand, we want to make sure that we become the destination of choice for foreign investment, we want to make sure that we don't allow our open borders with regard to investment to make us prey to technological attacks and other sort of attacks on our country. And we look forward to hearing from our distinguished panel here today about how we can achieve those reforms to CFIUS that wisely balance the need to protect our national security and other interests without needlessly cutting off the benefits that can be gained from foreign direct investment. And undergirding this debate are a variety of national security concerns, including countries attempting to use foreign direct investments in our country to access sensitive technology. It's been like over a decade since Congress last acted in response to concerns about the CFIUS process. I'm most familiar with the DP World debacle, but the world has changed considerably even in the last decade. The last time we addressed this issue, it was, again, through strong bipartisan legislation that came out of this committee, and I hope that this is the route that we're going to take. It's going to really require that, and we have seen that that is what is occurring so far. As we consider what new authorities may be needed to address the modern-day threats, I do want to point out that this subcommittee's previous hearing, the one we just had, the witnesses agreed that the greatest challenges facing CFIUS today is, Mr. Chairman, the lack of resources available to the federal agencies to do thorough and extensive investigations and reviews. So then when we start thinking about standing up our national security efforts, we can't always do it through a defense authorization bill. I mean, financial crimes are a peril to our national security, and we need to fight for the resources to protect these agencies. And I really, again, look forward to a good discussion on the key issues that we need to keep in mind as we look to reform CFIUS. And at this point, I want to yield the balance of my time to our Vice Chair of the full committee, Mr. Kildee.
Thank you to the ranking member, to the chairman, and to witnesses for being here today. Our second hearing in as many months aimed at evaluating the operations and challenges that CFIUS faces. CFIUS plays an extremely important function in the area of national security. Congress has an important responsibility to ensure that CFIUS is balancing the benefits of our traditionally open investment climate with the requirement to protect U.S. national security. Given that we have not formally reviewed the CFIUS process in over a decade, and the evolving threat environment with respect to certain kinds of foreign investment, I appreciate the chairman's intention to hold this series of hearings in the coming weeks so that members can assess not only the challenges that CFIUS faces, but also to determine an appropriate set of policy responses. My primary concern, or a primary concern that we face that I'm particularly challenged on, is the area of China's aggressive industrial policy and their efforts to invest in early-stage, cutting-edge U.S. technologies with potential military applications, including artificial intelligence, robotics as well, in part to advance China's military modernization and to diminish America's technological advantage. If China represents the biggest threat to U.S. security with respect to foreign investment, I would argue that the second greatest threat is an underfunded and understaffed U.S. government. A serious problem facing CFIUS today is the lack of resources. Even without expansion of authority, CFIUS already has significant staffing and resource problems. As the volume of cases and the complexity of transactions continue to increase, along with the need for an aggressive use of intelligence resources, any expansion of CFIUS authority, absent additional resources, would not only jeopardize the existing mission, but would also undermine U.S. national security. And I know there are members working on legislation. Mr. Heck, to my left, which is not something I often say, is working on legislation sorry, Denny, which would not only address authority, but would also provide a mechanism for additional resources. So that's important legislation. It's something that we need to seriously consider, and I appreciate the panel's willingness to contribute. And I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentlelady yields back. The gentlelady's time has expired. Today we welcome the testimony of several distinguished witnesses, and we thank them for their participation in this hearing. And we look forward to your insights. Dr. Derek Scissors is a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, where he focuses on the Chinese and Indian economies and on U.S. economic relations with Asia. He is concurrently chief economist of the China Beige Book. Dr. Scissors is the author of the China Global Investment Tracker, which shows China's investments throughout the world. Before joining AEI, Dr. Scissors was a senior research fellow in the Asian Studies Center at the Heritage Foundation and an adjunct professor of economics at George Washington University. He has worked for London-based Intelligence Research Limited, taught economics at Lingnan University in Hong Kong, and served as an action officer in international economics and energy for the U.S. Department of Defense. Dr. Scott Kennedy is Deputy Director of the Freeman Chair in China Studies and Director of the Project on Chinese Business and Political Economy at CSIUS, a leading authority on China's economic policy and its global economic relations. Specific areas of focus include industrial policy, technology innovation, business lobbying, multinational business challenges in China, global governance, and philanthropy. For over 14 years, Kennedy was a professor at Indiana University. From 2007 to 2014, he was the director of the Research Center for Chinese Politics and Business, and he was the founding academic director of IU's China office. From 1993 to 1997, he worked at the Brookings Institution. Admiral Dennis Blair is co-chair of the Commission on the Theft of American Intellectual Property. He serves as a member of the Energy Security Leadership Council and on the board of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations. From January 2009 to May 2010, he served as Director of National Intelligence. During his distinguished 34-year Navy career, he has served as Director of the Joint Staff and held budget and policy positions on the National Security Council and Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Pacific Command. He has been awarded 4 Defense Distinguished Service Medals and 3 National Intelligence Distinguished Service Medals. The Honorable Todd Kassinger is a partner in the Washington office of O'Melveny and Myers, LLP. Ted joined O'Melveny in late 2005 after serving from 2001 to 2005, first as the General Counsel and then as Deputy Secretary of the U.S. Department of Commerce. Ted is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and of the U.S. Department of State's Advisory Committee on International Economic Policy, which he formerly chaired. Mr. Rod Hunter is a partner based in the Washington, D.C. office of Baker McKenzie. He previously served as Senior Director for International Economics at the National Security Council, the White House office that coordinates international trade policy and supervises national security reviews conducted by the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, CFIUS. In that role, he managed CFIUS cases, including negotiating resolution of the most sensitive cases, coordinating the administration's legislative, communications, and diplomatic outreach in particular cases, and developing the government's procedures for incorporating intelligence agencies' assessments. He also served as senior counsel at the U.S. Trade Representative's Office, where he litigated cases before the World Trade Organization. Each of you will be recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of your testimony. Without objection, each of your written statements will be made part of the record. And Dr. Scissors, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am the creator of the China Global Investment Tracker. I think that my contribution here is primarily going to be to provide facts about Chinese investment in the U.S. and around the world. The tracker is every Chinese construction and investment transaction globally, including the United States, worth $100 million or more since 2005. There are more than 2,700 of such transactions, and our main contribution is you get to see all of them. We don't tell you what the totals are, and it comes out of nowhere. You can see everything that we include, all of our numbers. They're tagged by year, they're tagged by sector, they're tagged by name of the company, so you can see if it's a state company or a private company. So I urge you to utilize that resource in the process of your work on CFIUS and other issues involving China. Some facts. U.S. investment, Chinese investment in the U.S. fell about 50% in 2017. 2016, it was in the $50 billion range. 2017, in the $25 billion range. However, this hearing is focused on the globe. Globally, Chinese investment rose mildly from a record-breaking 2016 to about $185 billion globally last year. And the reason was that private Chinese firms investing in the U.S. were stopped by the Chinese government. Their investment was replaced by large Chinese state-owned enterprises investing primarily in Europe. I can go into detail, but that's the main event of 2017. Less private Chinese investment in the U.S., more state investment in Europe. We can easily imagine security questions that arise out of that change. By sector, in the U.S., aviation led due to one large purchase. Real estate was second. There was almost no successful Chinese technology investment in the U.S. in 2017. However, there were multiple Chinese purchases of U.S. healthcare firms, which raises an issue that I think we're going to talk about more of personal data. Again, there's a lot more information along those lines. I do want to make some non-factual points, but I urge you, if you or your staff have questions, we would be happy to help answer them. Point one I want to hammer home. State-owned enterprises and private Chinese firms are different with regard to economics. State-owned enterprises are heavily subsidized. Chinese private firms usually are not. However, in my opinion, with regard to national security and the rule of law, there is no effective difference between Chinese state-owned enterprises and private firms. And the reason is a private Chinese firm has no more recourse, it has no more protection against the Communist Party than a state-owned enterprise. So if a private Chinese firm has technology or personal data of Americans that the party wants, the party will get it. The private Chinese firm cannot protect that data, even if its intent is to do so. Not all data, not all technology is important, but I don't think anyone should think in this room or outside that private Chinese firms can protect anything they acquire in the United States from the Communist Party. They cannot. That's a factual statement, I think. Now we're getting into opinion for sure. There's an obvious split over what to do about CFIUS between the economic community, business community on one side, and national security community on the other side. I'm from the econ side. I like foreign investment. It increases competition in the United States. It creates or supports jobs. I don't think all infrastructure is critical and needs to be protected from foreign competition. But I've watched Chinese investment since 2005. And the sophistication of both the firms and the governments is still growing now. They will be better this year than they were last year or the year before in acquiring, coercing, stealing, and using technology, whether American, European, or otherwise. There's long been a risk, as Admiral Blair knows extremely well, to our intellectual property. There is now a risk to personal data as Chinese companies try to buy U.S. firms which hold Americans' personal data. What can we do about this in my last minute? Number one, we need to be transparent. In my opinion, for the foreseeable future, China is the threat. I don't like the language in some bills that talk about critical countries or countries of special concern. We're talking about China here. Don't put other countries in the crossfire. It's already been mentioned repeatedly, and I agree wholeheartedly that we need to devote resources to this problem. Loss of technology could come back to harm the U.S. in national security terms in a huge way. It's a small investment to try to limit that now. Third, I want action to be taken yesterday if I were in charge. Our current rules have not been sufficient to stop the Chinese from acquiring or coercing American technology. We cannot look forward to, well, we could do this better in the future, or this could happen. We need to take substantive action immediately, in my opinion. And finally, there is a global element to this, and I encourage U.S. global cooperation. But first, we need to get our own house in order. So let's do that first and then reach out to our partners. Thank you.
Dr. Kennedy, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Barr, distinguished members of the committee. I appreciate the invitation to appear before you. I've been asked to share my views about Chinese industrial policy, trends in technology flows, and the implications for American policy to limit diffusion of advanced technologies to China that could harm U.S. national security, including the role of CFIUS. Today, I want to make 3 analytical points and then offer several policy recommendations. There's more details in my written statement. First, although highly wasteful and inefficient, Chinese industrial policy has been relatively effective at facilitating both the domestic development of technology in China as well as the acquisition of foreign technology from the United States and elsewhere. Chinese technology policy, I think, could long be defined as engaging in techno-nationalism, but under Xi Jinping in the last few years, Chinese industrial policy is much more centralized than ever before, and steps have been taken to make industrial policy serve China's economic and national security goals. Just recently, China formed a national commission on civil-military integration. Xi Jinping personally chairs that commission, and its goal is to find ways to take commercial technologies and use them to help Chinese national security. China has set specific targets for technology acquisition and growing market share across a vast range of technologies, including electric cars, renewable energy and storage, robotics, commercial aircraft, biologics and pharmaceuticals, and many other areas relevant for the U.S. economy and national security. If you just look today at the Consumer Electronics Show, CES, which is opening in Las Vegas, fully 1/3 of all of the exhibitors, 1,500 of them are from China. Relatedly, China is using globalization to pursue all of these goals through international trade, sending students to study abroad, hiring foreign employees, foreign investment in and out of China, opening R&D centers in Silicon Valley and other technology hubs. As Dr. Scissors said, there was a slight downward tick in overall investment in China, out of China in the United States in 2017, but a growing share of Chinese investment is in high tech overall. There's some investment deals which are in high tech that aren't covered by his database that are important, even though at a dollar level they're relatively small. And some of these deals are acquisitions of mature companies, as well as minority stakes, and also venture investment in startups. Secondly, the U.S.-China economic relationship brings both benefits and problems to the American economy. Industrial policy is inherently discriminatory, and given China's size, Chinese tech policy could harm global supply chains and business models. But on balance, the United States, our companies, workers, consumers still benefit in many ways from our commercial ties with China. At the same time, the U.S. and China have conflicting strategic interests in the Asia-Pacific, and the result, while the U.S. has to balance issues of fairness and opportunity in the economic realm, the security challenge should lead us to be more conservative and withhold more technology than would otherwise be the case. Thirdly, American technology reaches China through a variety of channels, including investment, trade, employment, R&D centers, education, as well as cyber theft, industrial espionage, and constraining diffusion of technology in one area. It doesn't necessarily stop diffusion of technology in other areas. In fact, it may be more like a balloon where you plug one place and you'll see expanding technology diffusion in another way. So an American response needs to be comprehensive. It can't just focus on one avenue of technology diffusion. So let me just make a couple policy recommendations and then look forward to the discussion. In terms of the technology CFIUS covers, I can see it makes sense to expand the definition of critical technologies and infrastructure to include critical materials, data, and potentially IP because of how acquisitions of technology, even in their early stages, can be misused against American interests. At the same time, in addition, I could see the benefits of expanding CFIUS's mandate to cover non-passive investments, not just majority acquisitions, where the foreign party doesn't gain a controlling interest because Chinese, even as minority shareholders, can still get access to that technology, whether they're private or state-owned. I'd suggest several limitations, including limiting some of these expansions to areas of countries of special concern. I actually like that terminology and can explain why in more detail. One area I'd also limit is I would try to explicitly be sure the legislation doesn't cover American outward investment because it would be too broad and difficult for the committee to manage.
Thank you. The Honorable Admiral Blair, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Barr, Ranking Member Moore, and members of the committee, it's really heartening for those of us who have been involved in these issues for a while to see that Congress is tackling the task of governing the control of foreign investment into this country, and I'm delighted to be able to participate in the process through testifying about the updating of the CFIUS statute, because it's dealing with a very major and growing threat to our national security. The changes that have been proposed under one potential statute, what's called the Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act, or FIRMA, I consider to be well considered, very important, widening the category of covered transactions, expanding the specific factors that are to be considered by the committee, as well as the improved congressional notification, will go a long way towards plugging the loopholes in the application of the current statute. And I certainly urge adoption by this committee of those provisions of H.R. 4311. But I also think we need to think more widely about the risks of investment in this country by foreign companies. And I would urge the incorporation of an additional, fairly simple principle into the CFIUS statute. If a foreign company has stolen American intellectual property or has taken actions against American security policies or interests, it should not be allowed to invest in this country. This committee needs no education on the damage to our precious technological edge that has been caused by the theft by foreign companies and governments of our intellectual property. As we on the Commission on the Theft of American Intellectual Property stated in our reports, it's robbed this country of about up to $600 billion a year, more than our trade deficit with all of Asia. It erodes the competitiveness of our companies and the combat capability of our armed forces. And FIRMA would go a long way towards protecting our militarily relevant technology, but I recommend going further to prevent the investment in this country by any company that has stolen American IP. Big international Chinese companies like Sinovel, like Trina Solar, like Jiangsu Xinri Machinery Company. We should prevent investment in this country by companies that have harmed American security interests in other ways. The China Communications Construction Company, or CCCC. It was the company that built the Wall of Sand in the South China Sea. It acquired a Houston-based American design firm, Frieda Goldman United, in 2010. CNOOC, that sent its oil rig, the HD 981, off the coast of Vietnam to assert China's territorial claims. We should force foreign companies to make a choice. They either steal our intellectual property or otherwise undercut this country's interests, or they invest in the United States. Can't have it both ways. Finally, I would like to add my voice to those highlighting the resource consequences of expanding the scope of the CFIUS statute. Policy without capacity is frivolous. Right now, the CFIUS work in the executive branch is done by a group of the part-time and the willing. The application fee funding mechanism, the special hiring authorities that are currently in H.R. 4311, will put the right kind of people in greater numbers on the job to protect our national security interests. My business friends do not object to government regulation. They object to slow, incompetent government regulation. We owe them speedy, savvy decisions, and we owe the country the protection of its national security. Thank you.
Mr. Kassinger, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Moore, members of the subcommittee. Very much appreciate the invitation to appear before you today. It's an honor to join my distinguished fellow panel members in contributing to your work assessing the operations and activities of CFIUS. I wish to emphasize that I appear today solely in my personal capacity, and the views I express are my own. I concur in the sentiments expressed by several members that 10 years after Congress last amended Section 721 of the Defense Production Act, it is timely to take stock of how the purposes and processes that Congress put in place in 2007 have worked. How have they withstood the test brought by dramatically changing economic and geopolitical circumstances? Section 721 established the legal foundation for what is a critically important but non-legal task of the government, and that is to determine on a case-by-case basis whether specific foreign direct investment transactions present a threat to the national security, and if they do, what are the appropriate means, if any, to resolve those issues. Unlike some of my fellow panel members, I think that Section 721 has and continues to provide the fundamentally correct approach to balancing national security and economic interests of the United States, and that the process administered by CFIUS works reasonably well. There are clear signs of stress in that process, however, and there are serious questions to examine regarding whether CFIUS is optimally empowered and resourced to address current challenges. I think in any assessment of changes to the current process, it's important to look back at what Congress created in 2007 and then what the administration through CFIUS promulgated in its rules in 2008. These were thoughtful processes on all counts, and they leave us, I think, with certain principles that should be kept in mind as we look again at CFIUS in new circumstances. The first, to which many have alluded here, of course, is the longstanding U.S. commitment to welcoming foreign investment. I think second is that in the competition for global capital, the United States is well served by regulatory processes that are transparent, predictable, and efficient. Foreign investors and U.S. business partners understand that the United States must be able to step in where a business transaction presents a threat to national security. Nevertheless, before committing to transactions involving perhaps billions of dollars, they want to manage the business risks appropriately, including by structuring transactions to address potential national securities ahead of time, if possible. That is a natural business process. These two fundamental principles lead to a third overarching proposition. Any statutory or regulatory amendments to Section 721 should seek to replicate the principles that I think were achieved through the 2007 Act and regulations. Those were models of deliberative consideration. They produced an unusually well-crafted set of federal rules. The rules carefully define concepts and terms, provide numerous examples to indicate how the rules might apply to specific factual circumstances. That rulemaking process took about a year after the 2007 law was enacted. It was well worth it, not because the rules answer every question that arises, but because as a whole, they faithfully implemented the balance struck by Section 721 while providing useful guidance to private enterprises and entrepreneurs who are the primary sources of investment capital. CFIUS does face, as the country faces, many current challenges that were not present in 2007. The rise of China as an increasingly assertive strategic adversary and global economic power lie at the heart of most of those concerns. You have heard from experts in the December hearing and here today who can provide you far more insights on those concerns, which I fully share. I wish principally to observe that the complexity of the U.S.-China economic relationship itself provides reason not to lose sight of the basic principles of consistency, fairness, efficiency in a process that is adopted. Over the last 20 years, commerce between China and the United States has become ever more interdependent, and the rules going forward should address not only the threat from China, but also the continuing value of foreign investment in the United States. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Hunter, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Moore, and members of the subcommittee. Appreciate the invitation to speak, and I'd like to offer a couple of observations based on my experience in a prior administration and as a practicing attorney. The highest priority for public officials is, of course, ensuring national security. Our national security depends, however, on the innovation and the productivity of our economy. And the open investment environment and open investment regime enables us to draw the capital and ideas and talent from around the world to make America more productive, innovative, and prosperous. Recent increases, as my fellow panelists have pointed out, recent increases in Chinese investment have created concerns here in the United States, but also across advanced markets. Now, there are legitimate reasons for Chinese investment in the United States: diversification, proximity to customers, consumers, a number of others. Still, the deep involvement of the Chinese Communist Party and the state in the Chinese economy give reasons for concern, and particularly in this increasingly tense strategic competition with the United States and China. The CFIUS law was designed to secure the benefits of open investment while ensuring that the President had broad authority to block or unwind foreign investments in order to protect national security. The President is assisted, as you know, by CFIUS, made up of economic and security agencies, and importantly by the Intelligence Committee, which forms in many ways a key component of the analysis that guides the CFIUS work. In my personal experience, national security was never given short shrift in those debates, though there were, as all people who've participated in CFIUS knows, long and extensive, vigorous debates within CFIUS about the proper analysis of risk and balancing. In practice, any agency can force the escalation of an issue, of a case, up to the President for guidance, something which in my experience happened with some frequency. As the subcommittee considers CFIUS going forward, I would highlight 4 questions. First, does CFIUS have adequate legal authority to reach foreign investments of concern? CFIUS can reach any investment in the United States in a U.S. business, enabling a foreign person to acquire control. The control definition in the legislation and it is applied is actually quite low, so that CFIUS's jurisdiction is quite encompassing. There is one gap in particular around real assets where there's no commercial activity and hence no business. This can be a problem when someone acquires land next to a sensitive government site, something that Congress may want to consider. A second question is whether CFIUS is adequately resourced, and Ranking Member Moore highlighted this at the very beginning. The caseload has doubled in recent years. Resources have remained essentially constant. The most visible indication of the stretching of the resources has been the lengthening of timelines as applied to individual transactions. And indeed, the uncertainties around timelines, as much as outcomes, is beginning to have an impact on investment decisions of people from diverse nationalities. And no doubt the protraction is caused in part by the policy debates within the committee, but also, I would believe, strongly because of the resource constraints. A third question is, should CFIUS mandate be expanded to technology control? Technology transfer, as many have highlighted, is the right issue. CFIUS emphatically is the wrong tool. CFIUS was designed to manage risks arising from foreign ownership or control of U.S. businesses. It's a reactive instrument, it's labor-intensive, time-consuming, and frankly is straining under its current workload of 240 cases or so. Imposing a committee process, vetting the international licensing, joint development projects, even hiring by U.S. technology companies could in fact drive the R&D that's so essential to our economy and a defense industrial base offshore. The export control regime, however, was crafted for just this purpose. And while there may be important issues to look at in terms of the legal basis for the export control regime and whether it's adapting to policy, and those are in fact issues worthy of congressional attention. And with that, I would stop and thank the committee.
Thank you all for your testimony, and the chair will now recognize himself for 5 minutes for questioning. Let me start with Mr. Kassinger. Are Chinese and U.S. companies routinely structuring deals to avoid CFIUS jurisdiction presently?
Not in my experience, Mr. Chairman. I think there's a narrative that all minority investments are somehow designed to avoid CFIUS jurisdiction. I just don't think that's true. I've never seen that. Investments are structured for business reasons. The rules themselves, until recently, provided certain safe harbors for sizes of investments, and people often, actually to the benefit of U.S. national security, have pushed Chinese and other investors to maintain minority positions. So I think CFIUS has jurisdiction currently to cover virtually any kind of transaction that it seeks to cover. I don't think their circumvention is an issue.
Admiral Blair, do you believe that CFIUS jurisdiction should be more defined or perhaps even expanded in order to capture all of the transactions that you believe CFIUS should be scrutinizing? And on a related note, do you believe that there could be a risk of giving CFIUS too many different things to do so that it could not do any of them well?
I would say that the definition should be expanded, and then the application of that expanded definition should be worked out in practice, and that it should be governed by the size of the competent staff that can be assembled under the new procedures. So I think it's a balance of the staffing of it, but I don't think we should simply limit the CFIUS control transactions definition to what we see today and just narrowly tailor it. I think we need to leave some room to be able to adapt without coming back and getting a new piece of legislation, a new review process, so that smart people can interpret a fairly broad set of guidelines to protect the interests of the United States.
So in your judgment, should the committee make ad hoc decisions regardless of the structure of the deal in terms of whether or not to assert its jurisdiction?
Yes.
Okay. Mr. Hunter, given your experience coordinating CFIUS, what is your sense of the committee's ability to handle a broader caseload? There's been a lot of discussion about resourcing, but including these non-public transactions, contributions of intellectual property to foreign persons through licensing, joint ventures, and the like?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think that it would overwhelm the committee. The committee's is stretched by resources, but it is, on top of that, a committee. And as we all know, committees often require considerable deliberation to reach consensus. And going to the president for every significant challenging decision would be itself not feasible. So I think the ultimate consequence of a dramatic expansion of jurisdiction would actually be a poor performance by the committee in dealing with those transactions that matter.
Thank you. And Dr. Scissors, most, if not all, of our major developed world trading partners do not have a CFIUS-like process, or if they do, it's much different than ours. Can a stricter CFIUS process be effective if it merely incentivizes investment and innovation to flow to less regulated countries?
I think there are two answers. Yes, it can be more effective than we have now, and we can debate about how to do that. The U.S. is still the primary source for dual use in military technology. We're the leader in semiconductors, where the main Chinese research effort is devoted. So our actions by themselves are going to help. But in terms of protecting our national security, of course, it would be good to coordinate with our allies. Our allies, as you mentioned, don't seem to have this kind of process in place at all. And in fact, I know, and I'm sure other panelists know from personal experience, they look to us for an example. So the first step in coordinating with our allies is deciding what we want to do and then telling them why. I agree with your point, but I do think we have to handle ourselves first.
Fair point. Dr. Kennedy, final question in my remaining time. Your fifth point in your written testimony was, I think, a good one. You state that although it's important to protect the United States from unwise transfer of technologies, the United States also gains tremendous strength from having an economy open to flows of goods, services, people, and ideas. What specific recommendations would you have to update the CFIUS process without unduly burdening foreign direct investment?
Mr. Chairman, I think clarifying the definitions of what CFIUS covers, the type of transactions related to the types of technologies and the type of investment inward to the United States, I think would help. Also increasing funding for the committee, but not overburdening it by adding cases that could be better handled through export controls or other types of things that are better prepared to handle that increased burden. But the American economy benefits tremendously from being open, even though it looks like China is catching up fast and passing. China's economy also has lots of burdens as a result of its industrial policy. So we want to protect what's best about our economy while also making sure that our national security is protected as well.
Thank you. My time has expired, and the chair now recognizes the distinguished gentlelady from Wisconsin, the ranking member of the subcommittee, Mrs. Moore.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I have 1,001 questions, but just let me start out very quickly with Dr. Scissors. I noticed how cute your thing was, said don't pay any attention to, don't listen to my colleagues on this topic, only me. I'm wondering about the difficulty of differentiating between legitimate economic motivations that China might have and strategic motivations that may be a threat. And I want to congratulate you on putting together the metric. I'm sure I'll be studying this for a long time. Is there any, can you give us some advice about what we ought to be looking for specifically, a metric for what are legitimate investments and what are not?
Thank you for the compliments. It's become an enormous amount of work. When I started, it was very small and easy, and I think I may have made a mistake. Yeah. Obviously, the first thing to do is to look at sectors. There are some sectors where it's very difficult to see any sort of strategic rationale. The Chinese, like to buy soccer clubs in Europe. If they want to buy the Redskins, please don't take this as a political comment about the Redskins. I don't think we see a strategic threat there. So I think the first thing to look at is that there should be some sectors that are open to China because they will benefit the American economy and they have no strategic element to them whatsoever. I will, however, then say, to provide a caution, as I try to drive home in my statement, you can't use ownership of the Chinese firm to say it's strategic or it's not strategic. A private Chinese firm can be a strategic tool for the Communist Party, just like a state-owned firm can be a strategic tool. And if it isn't now, if it is a well-intentioned Chinese firm now just looking to operate on commercial principles, which is likely, 5 years from now it may not be. So I would use sector, I would not use ownership.
Okay, thank you so much. Let me ask Admiral Blair, you have extensive experience. If the president decides to not follow the recommendations of CFIUS, is this something that's made public? How will this committee is there any mechanism for our supporting the committee's recommendations if the president decides not to act?
It's been my experience that Congress has had no trouble in influencing CFIUS decisions that are of high consequence and category. The process is one thing, but once something gets into the press, once something becomes a big issue, it really gets higher than the CFIUS process.
So it would be public?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
It would be.
I want to yield the balance of my time to the distinguished member, Mr. Heck, on this committee, who has a lot of background in this area.
I thank the ranking member. I'd like to start with you, Admiral Blair, and begin by thanking you for your lifetime of service to this country in uniform. And in so many ways, your co-chairmanship of the IP Commission is something that I have specifically cited in the data coming out of it on numerous occasions here in this committee. My perspective is that we're here today, frankly, because there's been a problem that has been growing as a consequence of a lot of the trends and behaviors on the part of other actors, most specifically China. And so it brings us to the point of revisiting a 10-year-old statute and its adequacy for the current challenges. But it's also my perception that this body doesn't act unless we're at critical mass or threshold of perception of a problem that is going to get worse and going to be compelling. So I want to ask you the what-if question. What if we don't do anything? What if we don't act? What if we don't reform CFIUS? What if we don't increase its resources? What if we don't change it? Based on your considerable experience, look forward and describe as best you can what you think occurs if we fail to act.
I think if we don't make these changes, our military technological edge erodes in key areas, and so our choices are either accepting the consequences of a narrowing gap or else spending more money on defense. I think our economic competitive similarly erodes as those high technology, high innovation sectors in which the United States really has a competitive advantage are undercut by China as another competitor. So I think it contributes to negative trends in this country. Doesn't mean we can't overcome them by the inherent entrepreneurial nature of the country, by the dynamism of our people and so on, but why make it harder, I guess is my...
Well, they have been catching up. Are you suggesting that the velocity at which they continue to catch up increases?
Yes, I think it has in recent years, and we should protect our own interests in order to slow it.
Thank you, sir.
The gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the vice chairman of the subcommittee, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The preservation of our national security, I think, is every member of Congress's constitutional responsibility, and I and this committee remain committed to finding policy solutions which promote U.S. interests and keep bad actors away. I want to thank Chairman Barr and Ranking Member Moore for holding today's hearing. I'm also glad to see this subcommittee making CFIUS a priority. I look forward to learning more about this important interagency committee and the best ways that Congress can potentially improve it while at the same time still promoting foreign investment to the U.S. I thank the witnesses for their time, and I thank many of them for their service to this nation and their prior involvement with CFIUS. Our nation is indebted to your dedication. Mr. Hunter, I want to start with you. Thank you for being here today, and I too share your concerns about the gap existing where a foreign investor seeks to acquire an asset that is not a U.S. business. The example in your testimony of fallow land near a military base was particularly concerning to me because I represent a large portion of Fort Hood, the largest military base we have. So does a change need to be made to codify the inclusion of sensitive assets by CFIUS, and can you explain what a provision could look like to achieve that goal?
Thank you. I think the solution is really quite simple. It's just to say specifically that real estate can be covered. At present, you need to have a covered transaction involving a U.S. business being acquired by a foreign person. The limitation of a foreign business, a U.S. business is an asset plus a commercial activity. Fallow land, land that's not being used doesn't have a commercial activity. So you just define specifically land. Easily done.
Okay. Another question. I agree with your assessment that foreign direct investment in the United States is positive for the economy. When companies invest in America, they bring jobs. They bring facilities and further development. But it's concerning to me that CFIUS delays could create uncertainty that drives away investment. So how can we modernize CFIUS in such a way that makes the U.S. more attractive to development, but at the same time does not compromise our national security?
Thank you. I mean, a great question. The timelines, as I've mentioned in written testimony, have gotten longer in practice. The intelligence community does a fantastic job of producing their analysis very quickly, but it is a committee and so requires a lot of debate internally within CFIUS. The resources that Ranking Member Moore highlighted at the outset, I think, are a key component of that. Second thing is I would be very cautious about what additional responsibilities one gives to CFIUS. The export control issues are very important issues, in fact, maybe the most sensitive issues, but the CFIUS process would come to a grinding halt if one were to put all of that inside of CFIUS instead of doing it through a reform of the export control procedures.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Scissors, I'm concerned with patterns of targeted investment by Chinese state-owned enterprise into this critical U.S. infrastructure. For example, the investments that Chinese groups have already made into the U.S. rail manufacturing. Do you believe that involvement of Chinese state-owned enterprise in U.S. critical infrastructure has or could potentially jeopardize our nation's ability to effectively respond to national security threats? That would be my first question.
The way I'd put it is, again, I don't think it matters that it's a state-owned enterprise, except that they have access to more Chinese government funding. So the size is what matters there, not the ownership. I think what we should consider with regard to China is not what's happening now. Right now, China is trying to expand its rail industry all around the world, not just in the U.S., not principally in the U.S., mostly in Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa. But if it's owned by a Chinese entity, it is a future national security risk. I don't know any other way to put it. So I think what you look at is the size of the transaction, the extent of Chinese involvement, and the future risk, not the current risk. At present, I would say the Chinese have no interest in disrupting U.S. national security preparations. But a Chinese entity is controlled by the party, and if the party changes its mind, so does the Chinese entity.
Real quick, is there more that you think we can do to modernize our investment review laws to address the challenge we're talking about?
Yes, I mean, this is where my colleague and I disagree. We've heard people talk about not overburdening CFIUS. The way I would not overburden CFIUS is make it clear that there is one primary national security risk to the United States, and it comes from China. Everything else is much smaller in comparison. So when we give CFIUS additional tasks, whether they're a little bit of an additional task or a lot of additional tasks, we can focus on the primary country of concern, which is the Chinese side. We're not worried about the Iranians buying up U.S. security rail assets. They don't have the money.
Okay, thank you for your testimony, and I yield my time back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Washington, Mr. Heck.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Back to you, Admiral Blair, if I may. So I asked you to look forward before. Now I do, in fact, want to ask you to look back a little and characterize for us, if you would, the advances in technology and equipment made by the Chinese armed forces in, let's say, the last decade, and indicate whether or not you think that those advances were materially advanced by IP theft by the Chinese and technology transfers. Was there a role there?
Right, the Chinese armed forces have done a remarkable job in transforming from the mid-1990s, when they were basically a pretty immobile light infantry-based defensive force, to a much more advanced force capable of projecting in the near areas around China with ambitions to go further. And they have, in fact, leapt several generations of technology that other countries have gone through over many decades. And I would say that a combination of strict theft, breaking into companies like Lockheed Martin and Northrop Grumman and pulling out information which they accomplished, and taking advantage of the example of other armed forces, chiefly the United States, they've used in a pretty savvy way. And when I was Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Command, we could handle contingencies like Taiwan without scratching the paint on our ships, on our airplanes. Now it's going to be a tough confrontation if we get into it over an issue like Taiwan. And part of that has been the Chinese ability to jump to the latest technology by acquiring it by fair means and foul, and the foul means have been a major part of that.
So I realize there's an underlying disagreement here about how to deal with the outbound stuff. But before we get to the solution to that, I want to size the bread box and have you maybe describe what role you think joint ventures, Chinese performance requirements, and like the outbound stuff has played in their absorption, if not theft, and acquisition of technology that has enabled this more rapid advance and the implication to our national security.
Well, the Chinese weapons designers and engineers are competent people, and when they're devising a new surface-to-air system, for example, they look around at what the most advanced systems are. A large part of them American. They then issue orders to their intelligence service to go out and get as much of the specific data on wavelengths, design of components, sources as they can. The Chinese hackers, human intelligence, and so on know the companies and the...
Excuse me for interrupting, Admiral, but do our outbound investments play a role in that?
Our outbound investments.
Right, that's what I'm getting at. Is it the fact that we enter into these joint ventures with them and they have performance requirements which
No, from the military point of view, the primary theft that has benefited China has been their penetration of our domestic defense industries, and the cooperation with allies, the UK, Japan, and all. There have been some losses through our allies, but most of the benefit has come from stealing from American companies in the United States that are building defense equipment.
Not American companies that are operating in China?
Correct. In the past, mostly through coming here. I mean, there's certain filters in. I mean, American businesses are smart. They're not going to take their best stuff. They're going to be careful in China. So why go for the second-rate stuff there when you can go into the United States and get it at its source? And that's what Chinese intelligence units have been tasked to do, and they've been somewhat successful in doing it.
Dr. Scissors, would you agree with that?
Yes. I think there's been a progression in the way China has approached stealing IP. I work on the econ side, not the security side, so I can't answer your national security question. But I agree with the Admiral's point that the Chinese are now skipping over whatever they think is secondary technology and moving to where they think the best technology is. I used to tell clients, if you don't want China to steal your IP, don't go to China. That doesn't work anymore.
Thank you. My time's up. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. The chairman now recognizes the author of the Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act, the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Pittenger.
Thank you, Chairman Barr. I sure appreciate your support and leadership on this important bill, and certainly appreciate Senator Cornyn and the leadership and partnership he's been on this bill, and Secretary Mnuchin, who played a major role in writing the bill. And thank each of you for being with us today. I would like to say that the bill now has the full support of not only Secretary Mnuchin, but Secretary Mattis and Attorney General Sessions. Many others have commented about the bill and the need for reforms of CFIUS. Mr. Kissinger, I heard your remarks in terms of joint ventures. I would say to you respectfully that the Director of the CIA and Secretary of Treasury both would have disagreed with that they believe that they are an important, critical part of how the Chinese and others would pursue acquisitions. Mike Pompeo said CFIUS deals mostly with changing control of transactions and analysis. There are many other ways one could invest in an entity in the United States and exert significant control over that entity, and I think we need to look into that. So I would respectfully disagree. I would say that I would like to hear from Mr. Scissors regarding your perspective of export control regime and its ability to adequately address our national security risk related to foreign transactions. In your opinion, do you believe that the control regime has adequately addressed national security risk, particularly Chinese investments?
I'll give a disclaimer. I am not an export control lawyer, but on the Chinese side, I do have a lot of information, and I would say our current export control regime has not been sufficient to prevent illegal Chinese acquisition of technology. It's not supposed to do all the work, but we can say for sure it's not doing the job. So we can argue about where we want the changes, whether to be in CFIUS or in export controls or elsewhere, some combination. But I would disagree with anyone who says, oh, export controls are handling this problem, we're fine. That is evidently not the case with China.
So you would then concur that the need to expand, reform, modernize CFIUS would be important to address the concerns in the future?
Yes, again, how we do that and whether that's sufficient, whether we should locate all reform in CFIUS, I think those are big questions, and I don't want to use up all the time, but I think modernization and improvement of CFIUS is indispensable.
I think underscoring our concern lies is in a comment that Secretary Mattis made. He stated that rapid technology change is one of the several concurrent forces acting on the Defense Department. And as well, he said that new commercial technologies will change society and ultimately will change the character of war. So I think looking ahead in the future, our objective is to have a structure that will address the needs and concerns as we proceed ahead. Admiral Blair, you've obviously worked a great deal on intellectual property and matters in relative to national security. Can you please help us understand what we need to do to further tighten CFIUS regulations and rules, procedures to protect intellectual property and national security.
All right, we've talked a great deal about tightening CFIUS in order to protect militarily relevant technology, but I think CFIUS need not be simply limited to that. As the chairman said in the beginning, it was used in the 1970s because of concern about petrodollar recycling. It was done in the 80s because of concern about Japan. These were not military secrets that we were worried about there. It was the economic competitiveness. And as the commission that I had the honor of co-chairing testified, this is a hemorrhage of profits and competitiveness of this country, and I think it's fully appropriate that CFIUS go beyond simple, narrow military calculations and be used to punish and therefore deter companies that are stealing American intellectual property, whether it's applied to military devices or whether it's putting companies out of business in many parts of this country. So I say go further with CFIUS. Now, put the statute on the books, and then all the questions of implementing it in smart ways, getting the right people, those can be solved. But if you have the goal there, then you can build the capacity to do it and face these companies with a challenge. They either use the United States, they use our stock market, or invest in our company, export to this country, and play it by the rules, or else they don't. I think we ought to freeze them out if they don't.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank the ranking member as well. Thank the witnesses for appearing. I am concerned about energy. I am a representative from the state of Texas, so it seems that would be something that would be of concern to me and, of course, to the country as well. My concern emanates from technology that the Russians don't have. They seem to have the ability to drill, but not nearly as much ability and technology as is needed to drill in the Black Sea, where it's exceedingly cold. In 2012, Secretary Tillerson signed a deal with Rosneft, the Russian-owned oil company. And that deal would allow drilling in the Black Sea by way of the Russian-owned company and our very own Exxon. The deal was thwarted, but the question still remains, how will our associating ourselves with a Russian-owned oil company that doesn't have the technology necessary to drill in these cold waters, how will that possibly impact us long term? Who would like to take the first shot at the question?
That's a very complicated question, Representative Green, and there's sort of there's a tension there because the increase of the world oil supply is a good thing for the economy of the United States and for all other countries. It gives the United States a flexibility in its security policies, which we don't have when the price is high and it's only countries in the Middle East that can quickly increase their production that will keep the price under control. So I don't think any of us who watch this issue are against helping other oil companies provide more into the world market. Where we do have concerns is how that power is used for geopolitical purposes. And Russia has clearly demonstrated, particularly in the use of its gas lines, that it's perfectly willing to use that for political pressure. It's not been so successful in oil because of the fungibility of oil shipments around the world. So in general, I think cooperative oil measures are okay, ought to be entered into by U.S. companies. They're pretty savvy at not giving away the family jewels when they work with another company. They've been doing it for for a long time, and then we watch the use to which these oil shipments are put by countries like Russia or Saudi Arabia or Iran or other producing countries.
Would someone, yes, sir, if you would, please.
Just 2 quick points, Congressman Green. First, of course, right now, the Ukraine sanctions, both promulgated by executive order and by this Congress, preclude transfers of unconventional oil and gas technologies from U.S. persons, U.S. companies to Russia. So at least for the time being, that's not an issue. Second, I think in considering this issue, I align with Admiral Blair, but for another reason, and that is U.S. companies don't have a monopoly on offshore drilling technology. And so a question is, would we rather have U.S. companies there participating or cede that market and the presence that goes with it to others?
Just quickly, this point. It is my understanding from the intelligence that's been accorded me that within that deal, there is also an opportunity for Rosneft to do some drilling in the United States. Any response to this contention? No. Well, thank you very much. Madam Ranking Member, I greatly appreciate the time, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from West Virginia, Mr. Mooney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So one issue was brought to my attention about a year ago where the Chinese, although any country could do it, but the Chinese tried to buy a company based out of Europe somewhere, use it as a third party, and then have that company purchase an American semiconductor company. Lattice was the one that was brought to my attention. But I was just wondering, I guess anybody can answer this, but how do we detect when a company is being bought out by a foreign entity and then that company is also trying to buy American technology, a company that has access to sensitive or American valuable technology? I'll go ahead, Dr. Scissors, but anybody else can jump in.
Well, we do it, so I assume the U.S. government can do it. If you decide to focus on certain companies, like large Chinese entities who have funding from the state, you know what they've done in the past. So the biggest example quantitatively is not the failed Canyon Bridge Lattice Semiconductor deal. It's the successful HNA, which is a Chinese private firm with very strange ownership, purchase of CIT Leasing in the U.S. HNA did that through its Irish subsidiary, Avalon, wholly owned Irish subsidiary. All the money came supposedly from Ireland. But if you know what HNA has done in the past, you know that's a Chinese entity. And I believe the U.S. is perfectly capable of tracking back companies of concern or of special interest and knowing who actually owns what. I don't know that we do that necessarily on a consistent basis, and the evidence I would give is my number, our number at AEI, other numbers, not just ours, for Chinese investment in the U.S. are larger than the U.S. government number, in particular because the U.S. government treats that investment as being from Ireland. It's not, it's from China. We can determine that, but we may not be doing so on a regular basis. Sure.
Thank you. So first off, the legal structures, from CFIUS's perspective, the legal structures don't matter. CFIUS looks all the way up the chain to ultimate owners and control. So in terms of legal authority, that's there. What I think your question is getting to is whether the information, whether CFIUS is aware. Now, CFIUS an office from CFIUS does track transactions. They can see the public transactions that are reported, and they do a pretty good job at that. When there are government contractors involved, there are rules under the government contracting rules that require notification, so there's visibility there. I think the bill that we were talking about a moment ago, FIRMA seeks to deal with what is perhaps one of the gaps that may be there, which is particularly smaller businesses which may not be publicly held companies, where there may not be visibility in terms of the transaction, and that may be most relevant to what I think has been the constant theme in this discussion today is the concern about technology. So I think that was your focus in the legislation.
And I guess I was also to follow up on that. How do you determine if normally a company is owned by somebody if they have 51% of the stock or more? They are majority shareholder. But if a Chinese company or some other company in the world buys a third of the company or 5% or even 1% of the stock, are they then considered eligible to be reviewed by the CFIUS process because they have information, the sensitive information, or do they have to have a certain amount of stock? Like, how do you determine that, is my question.
It's one of the virtues as a government official, one of the virtues of CFIUS is its flexibility, both in its national security definition, but also the definition of control. Control is basically the ability to influence business decisions and financial decisions and personnel decisions. And so it doesn't really matter what the threshold in terms of ownership is.
And then another follow-up, and you can answer both of these if you want. I only have a minute left, but I read an article about a port or a trucking company, some sort of a exchange company that would have access to the information for a short period of time. They don't own the chip-making company, but they own the truck or the boat that's going to transport it, and there were some concerns about that. Is that also something that you look at? Go ahead, Dr. Scissors.
And this is a very important point because you have to decide what constitutes control. And I agree that it requires flexibility, and it's not, we're not always going to do a perfect job of this. My solution is it's where, firms respond to money. If the Chinese are putting money in a firm directly or indirectly, I don't care if they formally own it or whether they have seats on the board. Right. So if you look at dependence on Chinese financing, that's when you know the Chinese have influence. That's when you know data could be compromised.
I guess my last 20 seconds, Mr. Chairman, I would just suggest that if they control the port or the truck or the airplane and they have total control of that product for a few days, they can look in the product and get everything they want out of it and then go ahead and ship it. So that could be something of concern that we need to watch more closely. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman.
Thank you. I've asked the prior panelists same question. CFIUS does not currently contain an explicit provision stopping state sponsors of terror or companies based in countries that are state sponsors of terror, or other nations that support terror but are not formally designated from acquiring U.S. assets. Do you believe that we should put into the statute a requirement that we explicitly take into consideration whether the company seeking to invest in the United States is located and based in a country that supports terror?
I mean, my answer...
I assume, does everyone agree with that? Let me know if anyone disagrees.
I mean, if you use the word take into consideration, I don't think any of us would disagree. Of course, you should take into consideration, and Dr. Scissors has been quite eloquent about the control that authoritarian countries can have over their companies. But I think it has to be, you have to look at the company itself as well. Has it, in fact, connived in or supplied the materials for terrorism? Has it done it? And then you make a call, but take it into consideration. Yes. Absolutely.
Yes.
Mr. Sherman, I would just add two things. One is most, if not all, of the countries designated as state sponsors of terrorism are, of course, the subject of U.S. sanctions, which would preclude investments in the U.S. in most cases anyway. Yes. And second, I don't think there's any question that CFIUS would take into account in its threat analysis the status of the country.
I would point out that with our current trade relationship with China, they export goods here. They don't allow us to export goods there. When they do, they require a co-production agreement. We have a huge trade imbalance. And we can try to have governments stand in the way of this tidal wave, but those dollars do come back to the United States, either as loans or investments in U.S. government bonds or as direct controlling investments in our companies. And that the real solution to this is to impose such tariffs as are necessary to assure a balanced trade agreement. I'm concerned with the CFIUS process that allowed China to control the AMC movie screens. Do we have sufficient provisions in CFIUS designed to prevent them from controlling what movies are made in the United States? Because I'll tell you now, if you've got another movie about Tibet and it can't be shown on 1/4 of the movie screens in the United States, they ain't going to make the movie. Does anyone have a comment on that? Mr. Kennedy, Dr. Kennedy.
I agree that Chinese investment in Hollywood and influence over movies and China's effort to influence popular opinion positively toward China is an issue that the U.S. needs to be aware of.
And I would also point out they also control, because we've accepted and have not imposed massive tariffs in response
That's right.
to their limitation, first of all, the theft of intellectual property, but secondly, they limit us to 35 to 40 movies. So every studio is turning somersaults trying to make their movies favorable to China so that they can get in. Go on.
So I would agree that these are problems in the commercial relationship and things that Washington ought to be worried about. I just don't think that the CFIUS process is the appropriate place to manage that, just because we've already talked about potentially adding all companies where we've got all different kinds of IP problems, or where it's not necessarily a deal in the United States. So I guess the question is sort of from a practical perspective, what is the best approach? And I'm not sure that CFIUS would be the best approach.
If you buy one studio, you control one studio. If you control the entire Chinese movie market and a quarter of the screens or a fifth of the screens in the United States, then you control all the studios in the United States, because not one of them will dare to make that next Tibet movie. I'll try to squeeze in one more question, and that is, does the CFIUS adequately take into consideration not only the technology that's being acquired in the target company, but the technology that company has the capacity to develop? Does someone have an answer to that?
I mean, I'll say that's, I mean, I consider that almost impossible. The great thing about the American economy is how innovative it is, and today's company that's leading is tomorrow's loser because it's been surpassed. I think it's a legitimate concern that China or another country potentially buys a lot of U.S. startups because some of them may pay off. But I think CFIUS has a difficult task in evaluating national security
Is the solution
threats.
there to have CFIUS have the right to force a divestiture?
I think the solution is for CFIUS to have a re-review right, yes. If Chinese buy a company that we don't consider a national security threat and it becomes one later, CFIUS should be able to re-review the
The
process.
gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Davidson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Witnesses, I thank you all for your expertise in this subject matter and your willingness to come share it with us. So it's nice to spend some time talking about this very important topic for all of U.S. national security. Frankly, I spent my first years as an adult wearing our uniform in the United States Army, and I thought at the time I would probably never, well, back then the Cold War was going on. We were thinking about the Soviets and the threat, and then we think about China, and I thought I would probably never go there without a rucksack full of ammo, some body armor, night vision goggles, and all the kit. But I was fortunate to go there and do a fair bit of trade. So I've seen a lot from 2005 until the end of 2015 when I decided to run for this office. Now that I'm here, I see things that we're doing from a policy thing in a different way. But I'll highlight one of the concerns I had while I was at West Point was a technology transfer. Hughes transferred the ability to launch multiple satellites, in this case, could be warheads, from one launch vehicle to China. In fact, that was one of the first things President Clinton did, was shift release authority for sensitive technology from defense to commerce. And unfortunately, shortly thereafter, Secretary of Commerce Brown died in a plane crash. So we still aren't able to ascertain some of his opinions about that transfer. But I am curious to know where the gaps are between technology transfer, because if you think about a company like, let's just take Apple, they don't generally buy everything that they need. They license lots of things. So they don't necessarily control it, but they have access to exactly how it works. So could you highlight that interplay between CFIUS, which deals with control, and export control, which nearly uniformly the panel seems to say keep this separation between the two, but I think there's a pretty important gap to understand there.
I'll start, but there are practitioners here who have worked in this. But the shortcomings right now in the Export Control Act, ITAR, and so on, are that it requires a more defined definition of the technology, and it's generally at a more advanced stage, and a license has to be granted and so on. The concern now in the fast-moving world of military technology and other technology are the potential, which has not formed itself into the technology to build a device, but it's pretty applicable, whether it's artificial intelligence or high-speed computers or any of the others. Right now, the Export Control Act does not reach far enough into those things, which experts can figure out are pretty much a threat. So we need to fill in that gap between CFIUS and the export control, pushing from one direction or another. You all are considering CFIUS. I vote for having CFIUS take up some of the burden of trying to protect that earlier stage technology that will have military application soon.
Thank you. Mr. Hunter, you highlighted some concerns. Could you please address?
Thank you. Well, first off, export control issues come up in CFIUS, and CFIUS does deal with those. Export control officials participate in CFIUS, so there is overlap. Second, while we have a pretty robust, well-thought-out export control regime, one, the legislation on which it's based has lapsed, and so it's being supported now with through IEPA, so the temporary authority. That's worth looking at. Second, the policy process for which Admiral Blair was highlighting for designating which technologies need to be protected is not keeping pace with the evolution of the technology. That you might look at as something of a software problem, something that, again, Congress may want to look at, as well as the administration. But the tools exist, and they're highly adaptable. They can deal with evolving technologies. They can deal with transfers outside the United States of U.S. technology.
Thanks. Mr. Kennedy, maybe any concerns there that you want to address?
I'd agree. I mean, I'm particularly worried about Chinese investment in Silicon Valley and elsewhere with investment funds that then go around scooping up garage-sized companies that end up providing technology which has commercial and military applications, which I think needs to be covered. Whether that's through expanding CFIUS or through export controls, I think whatever is most practical makes the most sense.
Thank you. And I'd highlight, some of the things that we look at that seem nefarious. It's good that you highlighted that CFIUS does have the capability to address. So if you think an investment through Ireland as a vehicle, for example, where beneficial control is Chinese, perhaps it's because of the tax haven. So hopefully we've done some good with our own tax laws. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from Utah, Ms. Love.
Thank you. Thank you very much for being here. Mr. Hunter, you mentioned in your written statement that the recent flow of Chinese investments, $46 billion into Europe and $48 billion into North America in 2016, has spurred concerns across advanced markets. Since the United States is not the only advanced market generating cutting-edge technologies, unilateral U.S. action is less likely to be effective over time. I'd like to ask you, and maybe some of the other witnesses, if they have any comments to add on this, how the United States could best coordinate with other countries, either bilaterally or through fora such as G7 or OECD to evaluate the implications of these transactions. And what should that coordination look like? For instance, should we coordinate on specific cases, or do you think we should be more general in our coordination?
Thank you, Representative Love. This substantial increase of Chinese investment, as we've discussed and Derek Scissors has highlighted, is having a political effect across advanced markets. You've seen legislative changes, regulatory changes in Germany. The United Kingdom is considering its own CFIUS process. The EU has proposed a framework as well, and then there's a number of very sensitive cases that have come up in a number of countries like Australia. I think that the opportunities for coordination are two, as you highlighted. One is on the policy. I think it would be a wise thing for this administration and Congress to engage with counterparts in other advanced markets to ensure that their legal systems, their regulatory systems, are adequate to the challenges that are both transparent, predictable, but also address the national security issues that may be there. Second, on individual cases, the CFIUS legislation imposes strict constraints of confidentiality in the handling of information relating to transactions. That's entirely appropriate. However, those confidentiality rules could have an unintended consequence in restricting the ability of our national security officials to communicate with their counterparts. And it would make sense, it would seem to me, that just as our competition officials can communicate with their counterparts in other countries, that our national security officials can communicate with their counterparts about particular individual transactions. So I think both dimensions are possible.
So you think it should be, as far as you're concerned, all of the above, just on general policy and also on specific transactions?
Correct.
Okay, does anybody else have anything? Okay, yes.
So we have an example of CFIUS working with a country that does not have an investment review process already, which is the U.S. Coordinated with Germany to block a Chinese purchase of a German chip firm in 2016. We can do that on an ad hoc basis. What I think would be more useful is if the Congress, the administration, laid out principles for what they would like to guide the regime. I spent a lot of last year in Australia, in Germany, talking to governments. They do see this as a concern, as Mr. Hunter just said, but they are behind us. We're considering more advanced questions than they are. And I think the number one thing the U.S. can do to its allies is tell them what we think is most important. As practical as saying not semiconductor investment right now, that's
Are we
what
not
we want you
doing
to
that
close off.
currently?
They don't, I don't, talking to Europe about their political process is very confusing, at least for me, but they don't perceive that we're doing that. And one of the reasons is we're having an extensive and valuable debate here. My point is the conclusion of this debate, if we adopt some clear principles about what we want to do, that's the first step, and countries are waiting for that.
Okay, so the general consensus is to make sure we have at least our ducks in a row and then communicate that and let everyone know which standards that we're, okay. Would our European trading partners have any reservations about coordinating with the United States as far as you're concerned? Do you see any, in any circumstances where they would have some trouble or reservations about coordinating with the United States?
Well, having just been there and had this discussion, they're not going to adopt the same tactics and strategies that we are. They're actually probably more concerned about personal data, but they're also not going to get into a war over Taiwan with technology that was taken from European firms because they don't have the same military concerns. So I see the European side as more interested in economics than we are, less interested in national security. It's not that they will hesitate to cooperate, but they have their own priorities.
Okay, thank you.
Gentlelady's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Hill.
Thank the chairman, the ranking member, for this second and a good hearing on discussing how we can improve our CFIUS process, and I certainly think it needs to have the flexibility that keeps up with the times, both in terms of style of investing in companies or technology, keep up with the changing times in how technologies develop. So I thank the chairman for his work, and I certainly thank my friend from North Carolina for his work in bringing this to us. But we also need to keep in mind we need a permanent reauthorization of our export control systematic process as well. These two work hand in hand. One doesn't work without the other. Both need improvement, and so that's something that I think Congress should and must do. Also, listening to the testimony today in our first panel, this is something we've gotten right since World War II. We know how to do this over the years. We've had led the world in trade liberalization during that period, but we've also protected what we thought was important here in our country, not just national security, but media ownership. Control of the media was an equally important issue, telecommunications, utilities, and power generation in this country. All these things are important, so I don't want us to lose sight that we can do more than just the military application of technology in this work, and that is not inconsistent with standing as the world's leader in trade liberalization. Admiral Blair, I have a question for you, and listening to your testimony and reading it, Very interesting in terms of your re-review recommendation that came from your panel, review acquisitions that have been previously approved when new evidence comes to light of damaging actions by foreign companies. I found that interesting. Are you suggesting that the U.S., through the CFIUS process, have a no-buy list, that we actually essentially put companies on a no-buy list for just general purposes because of their, maybe what country they're, this is a non-sanctioned country, let's presume. What's your response to that?
I mean, if I were DNI again, I would establish an organization somewhat like our National Counterterrorism Center, where you have a fairly sizable, several dozen people, some of them full-time staff, some of them detail personnel coming from other agencies, commerce. They would have a different character from the combination of intelligence analysts and legally trained people that we primarily use to run now. And you would really have a group that knows about what's going on in this world of foreign companies dealing in the United States, dealing with that technology. And you'd have built up databases so that instead of having a research project for each new transaction that came along, you'd have a sense of where these companies were and who ought to be ruled out right from the start and who requires more research. So in that sense, yes, it would develop a de facto, this company is dirty. We're not going to approve anything that they do.
So we wouldn't even entertain a transaction.
No. And I think that would be a very powerful tool for the United States to develop. And right now, I would defy you to find that. I mean, Dr. Scissors has been very kind, but the people who work on export control within the intelligence community are part-timers who have other jobs. It's not that full-time intense, really understand the world. A lot of this information is done by private research firms, but we can tap that. We can bring them in, and then we know what's going on, and then we can make smart decisions.
Well, thank you for your contributions to the debate and your leadership for our country. And I'd like to yield, Mr. Chairman, what time I have remaining to my friend from North Carolina.
Thank you, my good friend, Mr. Hill. Again, thanks each of you all. I would like to clarify that I'm from North Carolina. We have in my district the largest hog processing plant in the world in Bladen County, and it's owned by the Chinese, Smithfield Processing Plant. So I have a great respect for Chinese investments. Notwithstanding that, I do have the concern for their focus today. Admiral Rogers, director of the NSA, stated that I think we need to step back and reassess CFIUS process and make sure it's optimized for the world of today and tomorrow, because I'm watching nation states generate insight and knowledge about our process. They understand our CFIUS structure. They understand the criteria broadly that we use to make broader policy decisions, and it is investment acceptable from a national security perspective. So I would just say to each of you, as we move forward with this deliberation, your perspective is welcome and appreciated, because this is a very important area for us to address. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Posey.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for having this hearing and for allowing me to participate in the discussion on the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, or CFIUS as it's known. Is there anyone on the panel who would disagree with the statement that national security is a mission of the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States? Okay, we all agree on that. Out of curiosity, have any of you ever read the book 1 Second After? It was a New York Times bestseller by William Forstyn, who talked about an absolutely incredible threat to this country. It's a novel, but it's based on confidential and some public congressional resources. Has anyone ever heard of that or read that book? Many are concerned about the entry of a Middle Eastern company as an investor and service provider in container operations at one of Florida's seaports. Since 9/11, the nation has been focused on the potential threats posed by containers as a vehicle for delivering terrorist activities to our shores. TSA is spending millions on screening of these containers. thinking that the entry of a firm like this with uncertain relationships with terrorist organizations should be reviewed by the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. And I'm just wondering if you're aware of any current authorities that would require CFIUS to be involved in this. Okay, seeing none. Recently, my office attempted to contact the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, or CFIUS, at the Treasury Department to discuss this inbound foreign investment transaction, and we're told that one federal staff liaison was managing 90% of the inquiries related to CFIUS filings. My understanding is that CFIUS does not have a dedicated staff at the U.S. Department of the Treasury. Two questions. Given the information, do the current resources allocated to CFIUS seem adequate? Could take a quick yes or no from each of you. And secondarily, what types of mitigation requirements or agreements might be appropriate in a case between one of our nation's busiest ports, containing a nuclear subbase, by the way, and adjacent to Cape Kennedy, physically adjacent to Cape Kennedy, and a Middle Eastern cargo terminal operations company.
So the scenario is, Mr. Posey, that the Middle East company that operates part of a cargo facility would actively allow a terrorist organization to use that access to introduce some sort of a device into the United States. I haven't read the book, so I'm not quite sure of the.
Well, yeah. Actually, the book is background material. This particular case, we have a Middle Eastern company, a container company,
right,
involved in a lease with a port. I think a very, very critical location of a port.
Right.
And I don't know even if it's even remotely true, but there have been posts and there have been statements to the effect that some of the principals in this cargo company might be terrorist sympathetic in one way or another. And it has amazed me that we've not been able to find any federal agency that vets people who lease property at our ports like this for our national security, for the interests of our national security. The agency we've contacted have passed a buck one to the other, and by definition, it seems like it might fit in here. That's why I was kind enough, or appreciate the kindness of the chairman to let me sit in on this and seek your information or input for this.
Well, I think you ought to keep on it until you get a good explanation. It sounds like something that should be. I'm not sure if it's CFIUS, export control, anti-terrorist legislation, or what the right legal thing is. But I think you're absolutely right to get a good investigation of this, so you're satisfied whether this is a clean operation or not.
Mr. Posey, I would say there certainly are permanent employees of the Treasury assigned to CFIUS matters, including the CFIUS staff chairman, and you might well go directly there. Also, the Department of Homeland Security has comprehensive regulatory authority over port security matters, and I would think they would have resources here.
I just comment, it's been made starting with the ranking member, and I think everyone agrees that the resources are crucial, and CFIUS is not resourced properly, in my own view, because of a surge of Chinese investment in 2016 that we didn't respond to in terms of resources. But I'll add one other thing. You should be able to get an answer. One of the things that's been raised by other people, and I entirely agree with, is there are some ways in which this process can be more transparent. An answer like, yes, we reviewed this company and we did not find any embedded foreign intelligence assets.
Exactly.
Privately made to a member of Congress seems to be appropriate.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired, and there is a request for a brief second round of questioning, and I'll start with myself for an additional 5 minutes, and then recognize a couple other members. I want to revisit this issue of the interplay between the export control regime and CFIUS. It occurs to me, or it appears, that there's a diversity of opinion about what CFIUS reform should look like in that regard, and whether or not the CFIUS process should become a one-stop shop. Admiral Blair, I take it that that's your view, that the CFIUS process should be a one-stop shop and that there should be greater integration between CFIUS and export controls, and maybe Mr. Hunter disagrees with that. Could you all amplify that discussion a little bit and help us examine what's the right policy direction?
Well, Mr. Hunter's worked in the, on the other end of the organization, but I would say in this area that having both belts and suspenders is not a bad idea, and that if there's some overlap in terms of the point in technological development at which you make a regulatory or a go, no-go decision is going to be moving. So if you have a company in which you have some of the top AI people in the world that's working on something that has a military application, and there is a minority Chinese interest in it that brings Chinese workers in to learn, and by technology I mean how to approach this, the human potential, that's something you ought to look at the early stage at a CFIUS level. Once this is turned into a device which can build a piece of equipment with a military application, then, of course, ITAR and export controls have to be considered. But there's a whole range of threat that exist ahead of time that I think can be got at better by CFIUS consideration at the beginning of the covered transaction rather than waiting until you know exactly what piece of militarily relevant equipment is there. And I think I'd attack it from the CFIUS end as well as from the other end.
And Mr. Hunter, what do you disagree with that assessment, and why?
I think there's a consensus probably across the table here about the importance of the technology control, and I think to the extent that there are divergences, it's about the best tool to deal with the emerging technologies. My concern about CFIUS is that it is, as I mentioned earlier, reactive. It only deals with cases that are presented to it. It's very time-consuming, and the beauty of the export control regime when it's operating properly is that it can be much more systematic. It can set rules that apply across the economy. Now, what has been missing, and I think this is where Admiral Blair is highlighting, and others, is the policy development, the identification of the technologies that need to be controlled. But certainly the tools exist. And indeed, Secretary Kastinger supervised the operation of those tools in his time as Deputy Secretary, so could probably speak to it as well. But this is not about a disagreement about the fundamental policy. I think it's about the tools.
I'm sensitive to the concern about the time-consuming nature of the CFIUS process. I think the Admiral pointed out that we should be able to identify, and I think Dr. Scissors as well, there's some obvious cases of actors that are engaged in nefarious activities attempting to obtain technology transfer. I think in the last time that the CFIUS process was updated, 2007 timeframe, that there was some deadlines and timelines that were codified in that process. Could we do a better job in putting some better timelines in place that would allow the process to work so that the transaction would be approved or disapproved in a timely manner? Anybody want to comment on that? Dr. Scissors?
I'm just going to take a couple of examples, and this is probably dangerous to generalize from, but I think the short timelines are now hurting us. What we've got is CFIUS not responding within its allocated time, and a lot of companies refile. That's not the system we want to create. We want to think about what's an adequate amount of time in the current environment, not 10 years ago, in the current environment, for CFIUS to respond to a company and then tell them that, and they get a final decision. They don't get a constant resubmission. So I'm not sure short time is the solution. Sticking to the deadline, whatever it is a better approach.
Mr. Kastinger?
Just quickly on that, I think timelines are misleading in the sense that CFIUS doesn't even initiate a case until it has spent a lot of time with companies beforehand. But second, I do think that the existing timeline should be extended. I think Mr. Pittenger's suggestion in his bill of extending the initial review period is a good one. I think we need it in the current environment.
My time has expired, and I will now recognize the gentleman from Washington, Mr. Heck, for an additional round.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Scissors, back to you. You've written, and I think asserted here again today, that you think the basis for CFIUS evaluation ought to be restricted to national security considerations. I agree with you. Not everybody does. There are some people who advocate broadening this mission. So I think this is a very basic issue for our considerations. I know why I believe the way I do, but as succinctly as possible, will you share with us why you think it's important to restrict CFIUS evaluations to national security considerations?
Two reasons, U.S. reason and a China reason. The U.S. reason is I really like foreign investment. It creates jobs, it improves competition, it gives better products to Americans. I want the default to be we let in foreign investment unless we have a really good reason not to. The China-specific reason is that because of the rise of China, because of the rise of their investment around the world as seen in the last 12, 13 years, it's a big job for CFIUS just to do national security. We've heard people who disagree on other issues all agree on that. I think we absolutely have to get the national security mission right before we think about anything else.
So secondly and lastly, I was fascinated by your comment in your opening remarks about understanding, however, that national security may be more broadly defined than we have traditionally. It's not just software related to rocketry, for example, but it could include access to personal data that can then be weaponized in an effort against us. I assume that you are aware that Section 15 of our proposed bill, which delineates factors to be considered, includes the following language in subsection 14, and I quote, "The extent to which the covered transaction is likely to expose, either directly or indirectly, personally identifiable information, genetic information, or other sensitive data of United States citizens to access by a foreign government or foreign person that may exploit that information in a manner that threatens national security," end quote. So my question is what your reaction is to that. Is that adequate? Would you have any recommended changes to it, or do you think this gets at the nubbins of what I thought you so appropriately raised at the top of this hearing?
I think it gets at it. I think there's a legitimate issue of when personal data actually threatens the national security, but I don't think there's any question that as Chinese firms become more interested in U.S. firms with personal data, there is a potential national security risk there. This is one of the changes that's occurred, and I think the bill responds appropriately to it with the caveat that this is going to be hard. Not everything involving personal data is a threat to national security, but it should be one of the considerations for CFIUS.
You're satisfied with this information?
Mr. Heck, I just...
Remember, I'm a co-sponsor of this bill before you respond.
And the first thing I would say is your definition captures exactly current CFIUS practice. So I think it would codify it, and that's a good thing. Second, I want to echo Derek's comments about personal data being a very difficult issue. I thought his original comment was any consumer-facing company would have to be off limits because they all collect personal data. That would include the Washington Redskins. Think how much personal data is collected by a sports team with its ticket buyers. So it is a very difficult issue. I don't think there are any bright line tests that can be made, but ensuring that CFIUS takes into account appropriately how to deal with personal data issues is an important task for the committee.
Thank you, sir. And with that, not only do I yield back, I want to reiterate my gratitude to the chair for holding the second hearing on a very important topic.
I thank the gentleman, and for the final word today, we'll return to the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Pittenger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, thanks to each of you all sincerely. I would like to clarify for those who may be watching this hearing that this is a bill, H.R. 4311, that is directed, laser-focused on national security application, and that is not by design or intent or purpose to have a broader construct than that. As well as this effort will be led by Treasury with some 16 agencies having involvement. So I think the purview of Treasury and the total engagement by the broad spectrum of our government is very critical going forward as we consider the direct interest by our adversaries in acquiring our technology companies. We have the right people who are positioned to review future interest. So again, thank you so much for being with us. I know that we have much more to discuss. I think as we all look ahead, we know that this is a critical area of concern for our national security. Thank you very much. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Thank you. And I'd like to thank our witnesses for their testimony today. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for their response. And I would ask our witnesses to please respond as promptly as you're able. This hearing is now adjourned.